They walk among us, almost completely undetected. If you notice them at all, it's because they're pulling a discreet tin out of their pockets so they can replace the small, white pouch hidden above or beneath their molars. Yes, I'm talking about Zyn enthusiasts. Though the nicotine pouch came to our shores over a decade ago, it's only within the last few years that its reach expanded from the boiler rooms on Wall Street to the open office cubicles in Silicon Valley. How did the product develop its obsessed fan base? To answer that question, I turned to Carrie Batten, the author of a New Yorker piece titled Zyn and the New Nicotine Gold Rush. In our interview, she traced its origin as a Swedish cigarette replacement, explained why it has the potential to radically expand the nicotine delivery industry in the US, and assessed the science as to whether nicotine is even bad for us when it's not absorbed through the lungs. Hello, I'm Simon Owens, and this is The Long Story, the show that features the best long-form journalism on the web. If you want to listen to an audio version of this show, subscribe to The Long Story wherever you get your podcasts. Okay, let's jump into the interview. Hey Carrie, thanks for joining us.
Hi Simon, how are you?
So I'd love to start by just talking about how you came around to writing this article about Zyn. Were you an actual user yourself?
I was not a user of Zyn myself before writing the story, although now I am. But I am a longtime nicotine user, somebody who was a former smoker and has kind of struggled with quitting vaping, quitting smoking. And when I was working on the story, I had kind of transitioned to Nicorette gum.
And I think you kind of talk about in the piece how you thought you were addicted, or some people think they're addicted to the actual physical thing, but it's really just about the actual nicotine addiction, and that's kind of the entire dynamic of where it starts and ends in terms of why people are attracted to these products.
Exactly. Yeah, your brain plays a trick on you where it tells you that you love cigarettes, or it tells you that you love vaping, or however you're getting your nicotine, when really the nicotine is the thing that you're addicted to.
So, what attracted you to the story? Had you noticed, friends using it, or was it assigned to you from an editor?
It was actually one of my editors, Morella Gala, who is wonderful at The New Yorker, she and I were just batting around ideas, and she sent me a list of sort of scribbled out different topics, and my eye immediately gravitated towards Zyn because it was something that I was already curious about. I don't really have friends who use it. My friends who are nicotine users are almost exclusively vapors, but I had heard it just being referenced everywhere. It was just one of these things that was just bubbling up all around me, and that's usually a pretty good sign that there's a story behind something.
Yeah, especially in New York, where it's been embraced by Wall Street and stuff like that, which we'll get to talk about. But Zyn was originally a Swedish company. It was eventually purchased by a much larger tobacco company. But so you traveled to Sweden, I think, to research this piece. Can you talk about the dynamic that's been happening in Sweden in terms of them moving away from smoking and the aggressive moves they've made as a country? And I think even recently they've been designated a smoke-free zone. What's been happening over the last few decades from them to move away from tobacco to these other kinds of products?
Yeah, absolutely. So Sweden is a funny place because I think in Scandinavia, it's a country that has a reputation, the thing of narcissism of small differences. The Danes have all these issues with the Swedes, and the Norwegians have all these issues with the Swedes. And I think the reputation that Sweden has is this very prudish, uptight, kind of overly health conscious society. It's almost like the way a lot of Americans view Californians, and so in Sweden, Swedes were using something called snus, which was a much heavier, grosser, kind of brown tobacco product that you put in your gums for centuries and centuries. And then in the 1900s, because of advertising and because of the really strong push by the tobacco industry and industrialized mass-produced cigarettes, smoking became the thing. And then in, I think it was the late 60s, that was when the first real reports came out. I don't know if it was the late 60s or early 60s, somewhere in the 60s. The warning bells had really started to be rung about cigarettes. And so as a result of many other countries took a really long time to sort of take those warnings seriously, but the Swedes, I think, particularly Swedish men, took it pretty seriously because they had this culturally ingrained option in snus. And they were like, okay, like we're going to start switching to oral tobacco. And so that progressed over the years. But even as we got to like, late aughts, early 2010s, women did not want to use the brown traditional snus. So women were still smoking. And
because it was like perceived as like making your breath stink, or like what was
yeah, and it's also just like a very rural kind of macho, in the same way that Americans have associations with chewing tobacco as being something that like burly hockey players and baseball players use. That was the reputation of brown snus, even though it had already been kind of sanitized. A lot of the bad stuff was taken out of it, and it's actually a pretty hygienic product, but it still had that like stench of cultural stigma. So women were still smoking at a much higher rate than they should have been. And white nicotine pouches were kind of developed with this in mind. So since white nicotine pouches came on the market in the early 2010s, women have by and large moved more away from smoking, and Sweden was declared smoke-free last year, which means below 5% of the adult population.
Yeah, and I think you wrote that like snus were so popular in Sweden that when they were joining the EU, I guess the EU banned snus, and they lobbied for an exception and received it.
They did, and it was a big thing. And Sweden only voted to join the EU. I think it was a 53 to 47% vote. So you could argue that the snus exception in some ways is the reason that Sweden is part of the EU today.
So you talk about the development of white snus. What's the difference? Like, is there just no tobacco in white snus? It's just pure nicotine?
It is pure nicotine with like a mixture of various filling agents, some salts and stuff. But what's interesting is it's very blurry, this line between tobacco and tobacco-free, because technically most of the pure nicotine that is put in products, in smoking cessation products, is still tobacco derived. But there's no parts of it's extracted from the tobacco plant, but there's no original parts of the tobacco plant in the product.
And then did the company that became Zyn, did they invent white snus, or they were just one of the companies to kind of adopt it into their product line?
So the guy who invented white snus, he's a kind of like Swedish pharmaceutical industry legend named Thomas Eriksson. He's 74 now, and he'd been working on smoking alternatives for decades and decades. He actually produced he started developing a white pouch with some colleagues like in the late 80s and early 90s. And eventually he patented a white snus product in the late aughts, and he was known very well in the industry. So the company this company, Swedish Match, they came to him and said, "Hey, we hear you're developing a white pouch. Can we distribute it for you, sell it for you? Can we buy this patent?" And then that's sort of how it happened. And there were a few other developers also working on some version of white nicotine pouches, but it was Thomas Eriksson's that became Zyn, that kind of spread all around the world.
And when he was developing it, there was this debate whether it would be like a medical product or kind of a recreational product. What was the distinction of that debate, and why did it matter?
Yeah, it's a very tricky distinction. This guy, Thomas Eriksson, the inventor of the pouch, he had worked a lot on Nicorette, and he saw Nicorette as a failed experiment because this idea that you needed to go to a doctor. I mean, you no longer have to go to a doctor to get Nicorette. You can get it over the counter. But this idea that a doctor had to be supervising you and prescribing you nicotine replacement therapy, whatever, that just wasn't appealing because people want free will. They don't want to feel like they're sick. They don't even necessarily want to fully quit. They just want to stop smoking, a lot of them. And so he really wanted to push for the quote unquote lifestyle path. And
when white snus came onto the market in Sweden, how quickly were they adopted?
In the market in Sweden, that's a good question. I think it happened. They actually came onto the market in the United States first. But like it was pretty concurrent. But Sweden, it happened a lot more quickly in Sweden. I think sort of by like 2015, 2016, there was a widespread embrace of the white snus. In the U.S., it took a few more years.
Yeah, so I think it came onto the U.S. in like 2014.
Yeah.
It wasn't until 2019 it went really national. What was happening in 2014? Why was it such a niche product to begin with?
It was a niche product to begin with. I think tobacco and nicotine consumption, like you form affinities and kind of brand loyalty and sort of preferences really, really strongly. And so any entirely new category in that market is going to take quite a while. Whereas in Sweden, everyone was used to putting everyone knew what nicotine pouches were, what snus was. And so in the US, the core demographic for the white pouches were the people who had already been using chewing tobacco, brown pouches, brown snus, and that was a much smaller group in the United States.
And so in 2019, so they were just in like niche smoke shops before, right?
Yeah, they were in Colorado and the Pacific Northwest.
Yeah, and 2019 is when they went national, went everywhere. And then they were embraced by like podcasters, some right-wing media figures. What role did they play in terms of popularizing Zyn?
Yeah, I think there's been so much media about like Zinfluencers, bro podcasters, and Tucker Carlson and this sort of core demo of white nicotine pouch cheerleaders. And I think a lot of people are quick to say that they're the reason that Zyn is popular, but in fact, according to a lot of interviews and research that I did, they sort of they're more a symptom than the cause of the widespread usage of this stuff. The thing that actually I think helped Zyn succeed and go national is just how hard Swedish Match and Philip Morris worked at getting distribution. It's really hard to get distribution for nicotine and tobacco products, like, even getting shelf space on, at bodegas and convenience stores is like a very complicated, financially significant investment. And so the distribution was key. And then these podcasters, they sort of added a cultural valence to the product, and they sort of turned it into a brand and like created all these associations. But those associations have been really, really sticky, I think, for people.
Yeah, and I think like there are famous instances of like a giant tin of Zyn being delivered to Tucker Carlson and stuff like that.
Yes.
As being these kind of big cultural touch points for the brand. And would you say that like the brand has developed its own subculture with its own language and everything like that?
Definitely. And it is sort of a subculture and a language that has a mind of its own, or it operates pretty independently from the actual corporate forces behind of Philip Morris and Swedish Match. I think they actually kind of don't like the associations that these podcasters are creating. But it's definitely, one thing I found really strange about the whole thing was like, part of the whole appeal of Zyn and white nicotine pouches is their discretion, right? Like you don't smell, you don't leave a cloud of smoke or vapor. They're tiny. People can't see them when I have one in my mouth right now and you can't tell. I hope, but and yet like Americans are so obsessed with like brand and identity and social media that like these people found the way to make their Zyn usage as like loud and proud as possible and turn this very discreet thing into like this loud brand, and which I thought was a very funny irony of the whole phenomenon.
Yeah, and like the hidden nature of it, like the lack of stigma has contributed to the popularity, because like even now vapes are even like banned in a lot of places, whereas like the discreetness of the product is part of its selling point, right?
Definitely. And a lot of people start zinning, I think, because they decide if they're taking a long flight and they're already vapors, I think they see it as an opportunity to not have to go through withdrawal on a long flight. So the discretion is definitely useful to a lot. It's a selling point.
So what are the demographics that have embraced it? Is it still mostly men?
Yeah, for Zyn, I think it's something like at least 70% male consumers. And I think the demo is, I think it's, somewhere around 2% of teenagers underage people use this product, but it's heavily male and it's heavily sort of men in their 30s, 40s, and 50s.
And it was kind of, when I learned about it, like I learned it through the lens of like its embrace in Wall Street, people being able to, work 16-hour days and stuff like that. Is that kind of a true understanding of who's buying it, or like what are the kind of job categories of people that are buying it? Like who's actually buying it?
Yeah, so I think the Wall Street stuff has been a little bit overstated, although it's definitely true that it's popular in a lot of finance sector offices. I think a lot of athletes like college baseball players, college hockey players who used to use chewing tobacco, truck drivers, who else? People who work long hours are drawn to it because they hear that it has this like stimulant capability. Although I personally have never, I've never used nicotine to stay awake. It doesn't like, if it has that effect, to me, it's imperceptible. So the fact that it's like being positioned as this kind of like, miracle pill that's going to help you stay awake is like a little bit funny to me, because it's just not how I use it.
Can you tell me about like what the science says about the health impact of white snus, especially versus obviously tobacco products? Like I remember when vaping was coming on the market, becoming mainstream, people were, talking about the end of lung cancer and how this was going to cause, all these like negative health impacts to go down. But then kind of the entire public turned on vaping because so many kids started using it, and so there was huge public backlash. What's kind of the science say about Zyn and its negative health impacts, and as it relates to vaping and traditional cigarettes?
Yeah, I mean, in total, like through my understanding of the studies and in talking to experts, the health effects of doing a white oral nicotine pouch of a high quality that is regulated, they are much, much, much lower than cigarettes and much lower than vaping, because the lungs in and of themselves are just it's a very sensitive organ. And so, you're the only thing you're ever supposed to be putting in your lungs, technically speaking, is air or like albuterol in the form of an inhaler if you have asthma. Like we don't take medicine through our lungs. We just generally don't consume things through our lungs. So anything that you're not putting into your lungs is probably going to be by default much safer. The main thing that, and also oral cancer is a very interesting thing. Most people who don't know much about the subject, when they hear nicotine pouches, they're like, well, doesn't that just mean you get oral cancer? And that's not true at all. It's not carcinogenic in that way, because so many of the cancer-causing chemicals have been eliminated from the product. And also, I think people associate oral cancer with chewing tobacco, but the rates of oral cancer for smokers are also very high. So smoking also gives you oral cancer at a very high rate. It's not limited to chewing tobacco.
Yeah, I don't know if this is apocryphal, but I thought I heard that like chewing tobacco has like fiberglass in it that like cuts your lip open, so it allows the tobacco or the nicotine to enter your bloodstream easier. I don't know if that's true or not.
This is incredible. This came up in my research, and in fact, I think that is apocryphal, or I'm positive that is apocryphal. And what people originally thought was fiberglass, it was actually frozen. What happened was snus was imported on ships from Scandinavia in the in the 40s or 30s or something. And because it was so cold, the temperature changes for the snus like created a kind of took the salt in there and created this like sparkly, like separated out some of the salt, and so people thought that was glass. So there's no fiberglass in at least modern regulated oral nicotine products or oral tobacco products. But I will say it's very difficult to study and understand the potential long-term health effects of pure nicotine pouches because it is a stimulant. It's a vasoconstrictor. It can raise your heart rate and your blood pressure. And it's very hard to overdose on in the milligrams that it's sold in, but we don't really know what it means to be on a light stimulant 16 hours a day for over the course of 10, 15, 20, 30 years, to say nothing of we don't have clear answers on how exactly addiction in and of itself impacts the brain chemistry. And that's why people, I think, are very scared of teens getting really into it, because in a developing brain, the potential for a strong addiction to mess with things, I think, is pretty high.
And like, how big is the potential market for this? Like, is this just a 1-to-1 replacement for cigarettes and vaping, or does the lack of stigma and the ability to hide it mean it could also be a coffee replacement, which would make it a much bigger market than tobacco ever was?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think these companies that sell these products, they want everybody to think, or their sort of, mantra is like, this is for people trying to quit smoking. We don't want new people to get into it. It's just for people to quit smoking. This is a health product. When in reality, I'm sure that they would love not like millions and millions and millions of non-smokers to also pick it up. And so I think the market, just based on what I know from writing the story and my friends and stuff, I have so many people in my life who were never smokers who then turned to vapes and got addicted to vaping, having never smoked. And I think that there is a potential for a huge market of people who never vaped and never smoked, namely teenagers, to get into this stuff.
And I forgot to ask you, why do people consider it better than Nicorette gum?
I don't think people, from a health perspective, I think it's almost...
not a health perspective. I mean,
perspective.
Just the experience of it.
The experience of it. Honestly, as somebody who's used a lot of Nicorette gum, like the strain that Nicorette puts on your jaw is pretty intense. When you chew gum for 12 hours a day or something, it's a lot. And also, Nicorette gum was developed in decades and decades ago, and the product really hasn't been updated. And so the formulation is just, it's flavorless, it's dull, it's hard, it's rubbery. It's not a nice user experience. Whereas this new category of white nicotine pouches, there's constant flavor innovation, there's constant pouch formulation innovation. They're just being made better and better and in kind of better flavors all the time.
And I think you said in your piece that it, like, the Nicorette causes like nausea with some people or
yeah,
stomach problems.
And it can happen with Zyn too, because what happens is if the nicotine, your stomach can't, the reason we don't take nicotine pills is because your stomach is too acidic to absorb nicotine, but at a high enough level, you get, like when you have a high milligram dosage of nicotine in your mouth, you still get some in your stomach, and it doesn't sit well in your stomach, so you can get hiccuping, a little bit of nausea, kind of just like a queasy feeling, and it's unpleasant. I mean, it's not lethal, or it's not going to necessarily ruin your day forever, but it's not a fun experience.
And how many competitors have come onto the market? And I know Tucker Carlson launched his own competitor. Like, how many are there, and what kind of threat do they hold to the Zyn brand?
In Sweden, it's hundreds and hundreds, and Zyn is actually not popular in Sweden at all. It's other white nicotine pouch brands are much more popular. Something called Velo, On, a few other brands. And in the United States, I think if you go to like your local 7-Eleven or bodega, like you're going to see, I would say it's like 80% Zyn, 20% other brands. I think there's like maybe just a handful of other brands that that have really gotten a grip on distribution in the United States, and part of that is like regulatory. It's kind of difficult to get your product sold.
You think there's just like a lot of brand loyalty with Zyn? Like it's not just about the product, but also the brand?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of brand loyalty. It's a very sticky brand from a consumer loyalty perspective. And but I think in 10 years, it'll be more like cigarettes or vapes where there's a much more diverse market.
Okay, Carrie, those were all the questions I had for you. Where can people find you online?
People can find me online. My X handle, which I never tweet, but it's C Batten, Battan. And then on Instagram, that is also my name, CBATTAN. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, this is a lot of fun. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much, Simon.